My name is Clara, and I'm 17 years old. I live with my parents and my younger brother Lucas, who's 10. My family might seem ordinary at first glance, but the dynamics at home are anything but typical. Lucas was born after a tragedy. Our older sister, Camilla, passed away before he was born. When Lucas arrived, he was celebrated as the rainbow baby, bringing joy back to my parents after their devastating loss. For my mother, Lucas wasn't just a baby. He was the son she had always dreamed of having. I can't say the same about my childhood. I grew up under strict rules, punished harshly for even the smallest mistakes. While my mother was the enforcer, my father, Eduardo, stood by and let her take the lead. He rarely intervened, and when he did, it wasn't to defend me. Over the years, I learned that my role in the family was to stay quiet, follow the rules, and never cause trouble. Despite everything, I've grown into someone who respects others and understands boundaries. My upbringing, as flawed as it was, taught me discipline. My parents never had to worry about me embarrassing them in public. I think about that sometimes, especially when I compare my behavior to Lucas's. He's growing up in a completely different world, a world where rules don't seem to apply to him. From the moment he could walk, Lucas was adored and spoiled. Every little tantrum or mistake of his was excused. At first, I told myself it was because he was the baby of the family. But as he grew older, I started noticing the cracks in this perfect picture my parents had painted around him. They didn't just love him, they shielded him from consequences. And that's where the trouble began. Lucas's birth was like a reset button for my parents. After losing Camilla, my mom, Anna, poured all her love and attention into him. He wasn't just another child. He was her miracle baby. My dad, Eduardo, always echoed her feelings, treating Lucas like he was untouchable. I understand that their loss shaped how they treated him, but it didn't make the favoritism any easier to endure. From the very beginning, Lucas was given privileges I could only dream of. My mother would laugh off his tantrums, dismissing them as just a phase. If he broke something, she'd shrug and say, "Boys will be boys." My father would look on silently, occasionally nodding in agreement. For me, though, there was no room for error. If I made a mistake, there was yelling, punishment, and often worse. The difference in our upbringing couldn't have been starker. When Lucas started school, things only got worse. His teachers would complain about his behavior, talking back, refusing to follow rules, but my parents always defended him. They blamed the teachers for not understanding him or the other kids for provoking him. No one ever held Lucas accountable. Meanwhile, I wasn't just expected to follow the rules, I was held to a standard of perfection. I had to excel in school, keep my room spotless, and show respect to everyone. Any slip-up was met with lectures about how I was a reflection of the family. But for Lucas, even blatant disrespect was met with indulgence. It wasn't just about discipline. Lucas got the best of everything: toys, attention, and affection. Family outings revolved around what he wanted to do. If I protested, I was labeled ungrateful or selfish. Over time, I started to resent the imbalance, not because I wanted to be spoiled like him, but because it felt like I didn't matter. My parents' grief had blinded them to the damage they were doing. Not just to me, but to Lucas as well. And the cracks in his personality were already starting to show. Growing up, my childhood was anything but carefree. My mother, Anna, believed in strict discipline, and her methods were far from gentle. She demanded perfection in everything, from my grades to my behavior. If I stepped out of line, the consequences were immediate and harsh. Yelling was a daily occurrence, and punishments often escalated to humiliation. I still remember the sting of her words as she called me names no child should ever hear. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. I wasn't allowed to express anger or frustration. Crying was seen as weakness, and talking back, even when I was right, was an unforgivable offense. My father, Eduardo, was always there, but he never stepped in to stop her. He preferred to stay in the background, quietly supporting her decisions. To him, keeping the peace meant letting her take charge, even when her actions were unjust. Looking back, I can see how this shaped me. I became hyper-aware of other people's emotions, always trying to avoid conflict. I learned to clean up after myself, to be polite to everyone, and to never make a scene. In some ways, it made me stronger, but it also left scars. I couldn't help but wonder why I was held to such impossible standards when my brother Lucas was treated like royalty. I often think about how different things would have been if my parents had treated us equally. I don't resent the discipline entirely. It taught me responsibility and respect. But it's hard to ignore how it was applied so selectively. The same mother who wouldn't let me leave the house with a messy ponytail now laughs when Lucas refuses to clean his room for weeks. The disparity isn't just frustrating, it's a constant reminder of where I stand in this family. As Lucas grew older, the lack of discipline my parents imposed on him became glaringly obvious. By the time he was 8, his behavior was noticeably worse. He would talk back to my parents, throw tantrums when things didn't go his way, and blatantly ignore rules. What shocked me the most wasn't just his behavior, but my parents' response, or rather, the lack of it. My mother, Anna, would laugh off his defiance as boys being boys. If Lucas threw a fit in public, she'd brush it off, saying, "He's just energetic." My father, Eduardo, would stay quiet as always, sometimes even nodding in agreement when my mother defended him. Their excuses weren't just frustrating, they were enabling him to become a person no one wanted to be around. One of the worst habits Lucas picked up was his complete lack of respect for boundaries. He had no filter when he spoke and no regard for anyone's feelings. He started making inappropriate jokes, often targeting me. At first, they were minor, teasing me about being the serious sibling. But over time, the jokes turned personal and downright offensive. I remember one time when I was studying in the living room, and Lucas barged in, loudly imitating my voice in an exaggerated and mocking tone. My mother, instead of reprimanding him, burst out laughing. When I protested, she told me to lighten up and not take things so seriously. These moments weren't just irritating, they were deeply hurtful. Even when his behavior crossed obvious lines, my parents continued to excuse him. They claimed he was just a kid or that he didn't mean any harm. But harm was exactly what he was causing, not just to me, but to himself. I could see the pattern forming. With every pass they gave him, Lucas became bolder, more entitled, and increasingly disrespectful. The double standard was undeniable. While I was held to impossibly high expectations, Lucas seemed to exist in a consequence-free bubble. Every time I tried to address the issue, my concerns were dismissed as jealousy or overreaction. But this wasn't about envy. It was about fairness, and the growing realization that fairness didn't seem to matter in our family. As Lucas grew older, his comments became increasingly disrespectful. What started as playful teasing escalated into remarks that were deeply inappropriate and crossed personal boundaries. It felt like no topic was off limits for him, and he especially enjoyed making jokes at my expense, often in front of others. One of the most frustrating moments was when my boyfriend, Daniel, started visiting our house regularly. Lucas seemed to treat these visits as an opportunity to embarrass me. He'd interrupt our conversations with sarcastic remarks, mocking my decisions or bringing up things he had no business discussing. His tone was always light enough to pass as just joking, but the words stung nonetheless. For example, during one dinner, Lucas decided to loudly comment on how I always had to be right about everything. It was a direct jab at me trying to correct his behavior earlier that day. My parents, instead of addressing his attitude, simply laughed along. Daniel tried to support me by steering the conversation elsewhere, but the damage was already done. Things like this happened more often than I could count. Lucas would insert himself into situations where he didn't belong, making comments that were rude or dismissive. His remarks about himself also grew concerning, as he seemed to push boundaries in an effort to provoke reactions from everyone around him. But no matter what he said or did, my parents always found a way to excuse him. One evening, while Lucas was playing a video game with my dad, they had a minor argument about the rules. Lucas ended it by saying something blatantly inappropriate, expecting a laugh. My dad gave a weak smile and brushed it off as if nothing happened. If I had behaved the same way at his age, I would have been reprimanded immediately. These incidents left me feeling helpless and invisible. My efforts to explain why his behavior was harmful fell on deaf ears. I began to question whether Lucas even understood the impact of his words, or if he was simply repeating patterns he'd learned from years of unchecked behavior. Either way, the lack of consequences only deepened my frustration with the dynamic in our family. The stark differences in how Lucas and I were treated became more apparent with every passing day. Growing up, I couldn't even dream of acting the way Lucas did without facing severe consequences. My parents, particularly my father, Eduardo, had strict rules for how I should behave, especially as a girl. Respect, modesty, and obedience were drilled into me from a young age. For Lucas, however, it seemed like none of these values applied. The most glaring example was how language was policed in our household. If I ever slipped up and said a mild curse word, my father would immediately scold me, sometimes lecturing me for hours about acting like a proper young woman. But Lucas? He could use far cruder language without even getting a second glance. Once, I overheard him making a particularly rude comment while talking to his friends online. I braced myself, expecting my dad to intervene, but all he did was shrug and say, "Boys will be boys." This double standard wasn't limited to language. There were rules about how I presented myself, how I spoke, and even how I interacted with others. Meanwhile, Lucas was free to do as he pleased. When he ignored chores, my mother would step in and do them for him, dismissing his laziness with a wave of her hand. If I ever tried to skip my responsibilities, there'd be a lecture about how I needed to set an example and carry my weight. What frustrated me most was how this leniency allowed Lucas to develop an attitude that bordered on arrogance. He started believing he was untouchable, that no matter what he said or did, he would always be defended. My parents weren't just letting him off the hook. They were reinforcing behaviors that made him more disrespectful and self-centered. Living in this environment was exhausting. The double standards weren't just unfair. They were a constant reminder that my efforts to do the right thing didn't matter. While I was held accountable for every little mistake, Lucas was handed excuse after excuse. It was becoming harder and harder to hold back my frustration as I watched him get away with everything. As much as Lucas's behavior frustrated me, I found myself grappling with an overwhelming sense of guilt. He was my little brother, and I loved him. I wanted to protect him, to guide him, but I couldn't ignore the growing resentment I felt. Every time he crossed another line or said something disrespectful, it became harder to separate my anger at his actions from my feelings toward him as a person. I often wondered if my frustration made me a bad sister. Was I expecting too much from him? Was it fair to hold a 10-year-old accountable for the way our parents had raised him? These thoughts circled in my mind, making it impossible to reconcile the anger and guilt that coexisted within me. It didn't help that my attempts to address his behavior were always dismissed by my parents. If I pointed out something Lucas had done wrong, my mom would brush it off, saying, "He's just a kid," as if that excused everything. My dad would stay silent, avoiding conflict at all costs. Their refusal to intervene left me feeling powerless, as though I was fighting a battle no one else even acknowledged. The hardest part was the growing distance between Lucas and me. When we were younger, I adored him. I remember playing games together, laughing at silly jokes, and feeling a deep bond despite our age difference. But now, I barely recognized the person he was becoming. His arrogance, his disregard for others, and his refusal to take responsibility for his actions created a barrier I couldn't seem to break. I wanted to believe there was still hope for him, that he could learn respect and kindness if someone just showed him the way. But with my parents enabling him at every turn, I wasn't sure if I had the strength or the influence to make a difference. I couldn't stand by and watch things get worse without trying to do something. On more than one occasion, I approached my parents to talk about Lucas's behavior. I didn't go in angry. I tried to be calm and reasonable. I explained how his lack of respect was affecting me and how I feared it would hurt him in the long run. But every conversation seemed to follow the same script. When I brought my concerns to my mom, Anna, she would smile and say, "You're overthinking it, Clara. He's just a boy. Boys are like that." Her tone was always dismissive, as if I was making a fuss over nothing. If I pushed back, pointing out specific examples of his behavior, she'd grow defensive. "You were disciplined more because you were older," she'd argue. "He'll grow out of it. You'll see." Talking to my dad, Eduardo, wasn't any better. While my mom dismissed my concerns, my dad avoided them entirely. "Let's not make this a big deal," he'd say. Or, "Your brother means no harm." Sometimes he wouldn't even respond, just nodding along as I spoke before quietly leaving the room. It was maddening. I also tried speaking directly to Lucas. I thought that maybe if I approached him as a sibling rather than a critic, he might listen. But Lucas rarely took me seriously. He'd laugh off my attempts to explain why his actions were hurtful, or simply walk away mid-conversation. To him, I was just the nagging older sister, someone to ignore or mock. Each failed attempt left me feeling more hopeless. It wasn't just that my family refused to see the problem, it was that their refusal seemed to make it worse. Lucas was learning that no matter what he did, there would be no consequences. I began to wonder if I was wasting my time trying to change things. Still, a part of me couldn't let it go. I wanted to believe that if I just said the right words, something might finally click. But each time, it felt like shouting into a void. The moment that truly broke me came on a quiet evening at home. Lucas was playing a video game with my dad, Eduardo, and I was sitting nearby, reading. Their usual playful banter turned into a disagreement about the rules of the game. Lucas, as he often did, refused to admit he might be wrong. Instead of letting it go, he escalated the argument with a flippant comment that was completely out of line. I froze, waiting for my dad to say something. Surely, this time, he wouldn't let it slide. But to my disbelief, Eduardo just sighed and dropped the conversation entirely. Lucas smirked, triumphant as ever, and went back to his game as if nothing had happened. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Seriously?" I said, turning to my dad. "You're just going to let him talk like that?" My voice was shaking, part anger, part desperation. But as usual, my frustration was met with indifference. Eduardo looked at me, shrugged, and said, "It's not a big deal. He's just a kid." Hearing those words yet again felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about the game or even the specific comment Lucas had made. It was about the pattern, the endless cycle of excuses and avoidance. I couldn't help but think about how different things would have been if it were me in Lucas's place. If I had ever dared to speak like that, the punishment would have been swift and harsh. I left the room, my heart racing. I wasn't just angry at Lucas anymore. I was angry at my parents for enabling him, angry at myself for expecting anything to change, and angry at the situation that made me feel so powerless. Something had to give, but I didn't know what. That night, after the incident with Lucas and my dad, I lay awake, replaying the scene in my head. I couldn't shake the overwhelming frustration, but beneath it all, there was something else. A nagging doubt that had been growing for a while. Was I overreacting? Was it fair to feel this angry? Or was I just letting my emotions cloud my judgment? I thought about the differences in how Lucas and I were raised. It was impossible to ignore how much harsher my upbringing had been. My mother, Anna, had drilled discipline into me with ironclad rules and punishments. My father, Eduardo, had supported her silence. And while it hurt to be treated so rigidly, I understood that their intentions, however flawed, were to shape me into a responsible person. In some ways, it worked. But Lucas had none of that. He was growing up in an environment where anything and everything he did was excused, no matter how inappropriate or harmful. Still, I couldn't help but question whether my resentment was justified. Was it Lucas's fault that he was treated differently? He was only 10 after all, a child who was simply learning from the examples set for him. Maybe he didn't even realize the impact of his actions. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him. It was about the way our family operated, the way our parents consistently enabled him and dismissed my concerns. I wanted to be a better sister, but I wasn't sure how. I didn't want to hate Lucas, but the growing divide between us made it hard to feel anything else. It wasn't just his behavior that hurt. It was the silence of my parents, their unwillingness to see the damage being done. So here I am, laying it all out. Was I wrong to feel this way? Is it selfish to expect my parents to hold Lucas to the same standards they held me? Am I being unfair to him for something that might not even be his fault? Or is it reasonable to want the same respect I've been expected to give my whole life? What do you think?